This lesson is on basic types of lighting and the sources of light that artists generally use. It's not an attempt to understand scientifically lighting and how it works. If you want to do that, look up Rayleigh on Wikipedia. That is spelled R-A-Y-L-E-I-G-H, the Rayleigh effect. He was a 19th century scientist that explained or figured out very accurately how light diffuses in the atmosphere and why the sun is yellow, why the sky is blue. Very enlightening, so I urge you to go look at that if you want to know more about this in detail. But we're going to be looking at how artists have used it in the past and in greatly simplified forms. So there are three basic sources of light that artists have used: the primary, the sun, or an artificial light, and it's usually, more often than not, a point source of light. And generally it's called the primary or most important light. It's generally warmer. It's also emanating from a fixed point, usually almost impossibly small, but what this tends to produce is hard cast shadows. As that light source gets larger to the disk of the sun, or even something coming through a window and diffusing through a window, the primary source can get a little bit more diffused, but generally it is a point source, and that contrasts well with the two other sources of light, which is bounce light and diffuse light. These two are diffuse, this one is a point source. They operate very differently. Get into that in a bit. So the bounce source is really just the primary source bouncing off the environment and back into your subject. And that can either be ignored or played up. It's entirely up to you. And we'll be looking at these different types of light, and they are defined as how they use these different types of light. The diffuse source is cool or neutral, generally cool, but if it's cloudy then it's more neutral. Diffuse source from the hemisphere of the sky. So the earliest type of realistic lighting is, for lack of a better term, I call it classical lighting, what you'd see in Renaissance times. A good example is Rembrandt. So here's an example of the master himself. You can see that it is lit very well in the light side, but the shaded side is fairly dark and very little detail going on. And as we go on these other types of lighting, you'll see how that is very characteristic of that time, and the main difference between these types of lighting is the treatment of shadow and bounce light and diffuse light as things become more naturalistic. And that's not to say they become better, and that's kind of ridiculous to think of it that way. I prefer to look at it like, as time has gone on and people understand more about lighting, the artist has more choices, and there are people working today that still work as Rembrandt did, and they, for whatever reason, prefer a very strong value contrast in their work. And something that has very little value contrast, it just doesn't work for them, so that's fine. As a matter of illustrating this, in the beginning there was dark, and we have Rembrandt lighting. Very flat, very dark, but the lit side is very well illuminated. Also, this may be familiar to you because it's a variation of the way we started in the last lesson. We have black, we have white, and instead of lines, they're areas of light. So did I draw the blacks first and leave the white, or did I draw the white first? It doesn't really matter. So as we move forward in time, let's look at this again. 19th century lighting. Again, there's actually no such thing, but I'm just using it as a generalization of how people painted in that time period. It's not quite as extreme in contrast as the Renaissance lighting, but it still is very dark. And if you see paintings in a museum, you just see how incredibly dark a lot of them are, even the 19th century. So the academic tradition really did move things somewhat forward, so let's say about that much. So now we have some light hitting the object, hitting the environment, and bouncing back in. But what I didn't do is the background. So where is all this light coming from, which is why it looks so strange. So let's put something back there that will make a certain amount of sense. Now I'm going to make it a little bit lighter, because we're assuming that this light is coming through a hole in the ceiling, hitting here, and this is a white object, and bouncing off this surface and then back into this surface. So the light that we're seeing here is already bounced off a surface once. You saw how strange it looked when this was entirely black. This starts to look self-illuminating. So what your brain is saying is, where's that light coming from? So you got to kind of put some light back there. Now that looks much more naturalistic. Maybe in the 19th century they would not, of course, made this blown out white. It would probably be something more like that. And then modulate the darks and put in darks where it needs to be. But there is not huge areas of black, unless they're quite academic, which some were. So moving forward in time, Impressionist lighting, the Impressionists are a little bit of a special case. Technically and correctly, they used color and somewhat ignored value. They're using shape. I mean, yes, people like Monet were into very precisely observing the color that they saw, but oftentimes Impressionists would use color at whatever value that color was its most intense. And value wasn't really that important. The drawing and rendering wasn't very important to them as well. So this, you might get a little bit more light. You might get some temperature variations. And then we'd have to modify this color to somewhat simulate or reflect what's going on in the environment. And maybe the reflected light isn't that strong, but there would be much stronger color. And even back here, so there you're getting a good amount of color bounce. You're getting local color, local value. It's not quite as dread dark as either the classical lighting or the 19th century lighting. Now there are a lot of hybrids in the 19th century between people who experimented with Impressionism but were not strict Impressionists. Say, for instance, this painting. This is an interesting case because is this person in shadow or are they in light? Well, they're fully in shadow. This is all in light back here, but this is still fully exposed. This is blown out. So you can paint in a way where you can bias your exposure one way or the other. Or you could, there's no reason why this could not be fully rendered by just using a few more values. But I think graphically, they wanted the feeling of overexposure here. But this is a good example of a hybrid between an academic 19th century painter and Impressionism, where they're starting to look at the way things really appear, being less influenced by classical lighting, by the Renaissance lighting, and getting outdoors. They're not only being influenced by Impressionists, but by the way things really look. So the next type of lighting is something that we are more familiar with. HDR lighting stands for high dynamic range, and that is where the lit side and shaded side are fully exposed and there's a full range of value between them. It eliminates shadow. It's a very interesting way of thinking if you're an artist, because in art school we are taught to see this way, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Teachers saying, well, you've got to have a lit side, you've got to have a shaded side. This should be a number 3 value, this should be a number 7 value. That's all well and good, but there's a lot of different ways that you could be doing this, and having that type of rule floating around inside your head is, I think, not a good idea. So let's look at what would happen if this were an HDR. So I'd probably leave this alone, although I could make it a little bit lighter. So I have a little bit more room in the shadowed side, but this would become quite a bit brighter. The reflected light would still work that way. Probably even still have some color there. And the background would be fully exposed as well. So now we're out in the sunlight. But one thing's missing here as far as HDR lighting, and that is the hemisphere of the sky. So let's add that, because up to now we've been indoors with a dark environment and only considering the primary light source and the bounce source, just these two. Now we can add the third. So let's put a gradation to stand for the sky. And now we can lighten this up, and I'm going to break it along this line here, zygomatic arch, which defines where the head is broken from this plane to this plane. This plane's facing down, this one's facing up. So that's too bright. Like that, and then maybe things facing down that way get lighter there. Now where else are we going to be seeing that sky filling in? Well, we're probably going to see it in this nose, and there'll probably be a gradation going back because this is seeing more of the sky than this is. This is being hidden from the sky. It's easier to visualize if you think of yourself as a tiny being and you're standing on that surface. What are you seeing when you are right there? Here you'd be seeing quite a bit of the sky, and off somewhere in the distance is this gigantic eye and head, but you'd be seeing a lot of the sky. If you look straight up, what would you see? You'd see sky. But let's say you hiked back in here to the inside of the orbit of the eye. What do you see now? If you look straight up, you're seeing the underneath of the brow. You are very much shaded from the bright light source, the diffuse source of the sky. So this is going to go a little darker, probably a little warmer, and then gradates out from there. This is going to get light on the bottom or from the ground. This will be more ground, probably with a break. That's a fairly sharp plane change there. The eye itself, the ball of the eye, for the same reason this is dark, you might not see much light or much sky influence on the top part of that eye, but you will see reflected light from the ground on the bottom of that ball. This is quite a bit lighter. Bottom here, lighter. Shadow there, lighter. Why is that warm? And that's cool. The form goes in, out, like that. This is facing down, this is facing up. Now this is being lit by the primary source, so you're not seeing that cool because the primary source is much, much brighter. But also notice the primary source is making all these cast shadow edges, which the diffuse source is not. So the top of the ear will get some of that sky, and then the inside plane of the ear, that is facing up a little bit less crudely. And probably the darkest part, or a darker part, would be this area right there. Now why would that go dark? It's clearly shaded from the sky, so there's very little diffuse from the sky, that cool diffuse. And it's close enough to the ground, and possibly there is a shadow where this is resting on the surface. So there could be an area that is not getting reflected light from either source. And that dark reinforces the cylinder of the neck. So let's look at some examples of artwork and analyze them in terms of which of these sources of light do they use, what category do they fall into, are they hybrids, are they fall very much into one specific type. We've already looked at Rembrandt, very much in classical lighting style. This is very much in the classical lighting style. There's very little color bounce. there's very little color at all. It's almost a black and white drawing with some local values in there. So I reinterpreted it as maybe a hybrid 19th century impressionist might. So look at this head where the shaded side is facing the sky. It's bluer down here. That's a little bit warmer. Bottom plane here is greener because of all this green. This is facing up in shadow, so it's getting cool. It should probably be a lot lighter. Look at the shadow of this head, whereas here it's simply modulated light to dark with very little color shift. And here there's a strong difference in local color. It's not local color, but there's a big difference between lit side and shaded side in terms of color. Same thing in here. The shaded side are retaining the color that you would probably actually see if you were there. I doubt if you were really looking at this, would it look like that. So this is an attempt to reinterpret a classical subject in a modified impressionist 19th century style. This is, well, you can see it's 1932, and you can see the effects of Impressionism, but also it's kind of a high-keyed classical lighting, but with a bit of HDR thrown in. Now, there's something about HDR that I haven't quite gone over yet, and that is when you start throwing huge amounts of light around, there's very little to distort what colors actually are, the local value and color of something. Let's increase the light levels here. There, and then there. There's very little difference between shaded side and lit side now. I mean, there's some, but this is kind of a overexposed look. But if you were to paint different local values, like say for instance, the color of the iris, the color of the eyebrows, the eyelashes, they would be very close to what their actual color is, almost like putting it in a light box, because that's kind of what a light box is you want light coming in from every direction so that you see as clearly as possible what something's true color is. It's an interesting effect, like this. In a way, you could look at this style of working and think that it's kind of along those lines, where you simply have shapes, but there's not much modeling inside the shapes. They're really very flat, and light is hitting it everywhere. The shadows are gone. Everything retains its natural local color and value. So let's look at another example of HDR lighting. You could say that this is because it's using some blacks. It's not truly Impressionism, it's modified Impressionism, but to me what really makes it Impressionism, how I look at it, is this type of HDR lighting, where there is no dark shadows. The shadows are held back to only a few places, and then local color and value are respected in terms of these shapes. The shapes have an integrity because of almost a flat color. This is another example where this white dress, there's very little modeling in here, and there's very little modeling in this outside shape too. There's light literally coming in from everywhere, and you see the difference between dress and skin, because skin is much darker in this world. And all of these characters are in deep shadow. And you kind of think like, well, I wonder how Rembrandt would have thought of this type of lighting. It's really quite interesting. But if this scene were being photographed today, you could bracket the exposures and get a similar kind of effect that Sorolla has gotten here. But one thing you have to realize is kind of a tricky thing about this style of lighting is how flat these larger areas are. As soon as you start trying to model some of this, pretty soon you're going to lose this shape to that shape. So it relies on the integrity of these areas of local value and then staying flat within inside of them, not really modeling a whole lot. So we were looking at this one a minute ago, and you can see how the integrity of the human figure is made by keeping it fairly flat. There's a lot of modeling, a lot of very subtle temperature and saturation changes and color changes, but the overall silhouette is unbroken. The same thing back here, the same thing back there, and there's light coming in from everywhere. There really is no area that's going flat and dark. So light is coming into this scene and bouncing a million times everywhere. It kind of gives a wrap. And it is kind of an interesting interpretation of this because, how this would have been handled very differently in Rembrandt's time. I can just see this being lit with a strong cast shadow and very dark, and this character just seeing a little bit of reflected light, but all this being lost into the background and very, very dark. And this character probably getting some dramatic reflected light off this character, maybe a cast shadow across here. That's one of those things that you kind of have to think to yourself is, what type of art do you want to do? This could be made very, very dramatic given the Rembrandt treatment, the classical lighting treatment, but also look at how beautiful the detail and the color and the volumes that are achieved by careful rendering of local value and using the ideas of HDR lighting and impressionist lighting to bring out the color of all this. Some people would say, well, this flattens things out. You really do need to put that contrast in to get a really strong, well, forgive me, but this would be across there, and then this would all go into shadow. Something like that. And then this back here would just be gone. And same thing there. So you get this really strong graphic feeling to it. It's already looking a bit more Rembrandt-y. So if you were to look at this from across the room, would you be more attracted to it? Is it aesthetically what you're after? To me, that's the whole point of this lesson, is I want you to make conscious choices about the type of lighting that you use and the range of contrasts, and not rely on, okay, how bright should my shadows be? How bright should the lit side be? And write that down in a notebook, and that's the way it is. You can see from all these different examples, like from this to this to this, how they all modulate what's in shadow and redefine what is in shadow and how you handle shadows for very interesting effects. Let's look at another couple images that are really very surprising. So you might look at this and say, is that HDR lighting? Well, I suppose it kind of is, because there is no light and shadow here. It's all shape, and it's all local color and all value. Now, it reads very well because the shapes are precisely drawn and quite accurate, but there really is no lighting on it. This house is, as characteristic of HDR lighting, this house is what it is color-wise. The roof is that, this is green, this is gray, just a slight bit of modeling here and there. So the colors that you're seeing and the values that you're seeing are the colors and values of what those objects really are. Say this one too, Kiefer drawing. There's no lighting, there's no volume to it at all. Light is coming from every direction, and the only thing that's showing any depth at all is the pattern of the drawing. But clearly, naturalistic dimensional lighting is not what this artist was after. It's fine with me. I think it's fascinating, that different people can ignore these things that we're all taught in art school with stunning effect. And me, this is a stunning image, and completely blows out of the water any ideas about naturalistic lighting and value. If you look at Egon Schiele, who was very much influenced by Klimt, and they were contemporaries, he does kind of the same thing where there is no lit and shaded side. There's no interpretation of light and shadow. It's all shape and texture and local value and color. I think that this was either a conscious or unconscious reaction against highly finished academic painting that had preceded them in the past 80 years before they were around. People getting out a blender brush and spending 3 weeks rendering every single little form and figure, the fetish with finish. I think this was a reaction against that. but also it's quite flat, so it's decorative. HDR can tend to look a little flat. It turns into a texture almost, and sometimes it can almost be difficult to find what's going on because you don't have that overall organizing aspect of classical lighting. Like, in here, this would be very easy to tell what's going on from across the room. This is somewhat flatter, but to my eye, it's more interesting. It draws me. I want to go look at this more than if it had tons of black in it. And I know that in industrial rendering, I was always taught that contrast is your best friend. And I don't agree with that idea. I think that the human eye and mind are more sophisticated than that and are attracted to something that is more real than simply contrast. They're really attuned to seeing the shapes of faces. I see this just fine. So it's a matter of personal taste. So now let's talk about the effects of atmosphere. So like with this image, there's very little atmospheric perspective. As things go back in space, you are looking through more atmosphere, which has particles of dust in it, and that has very specific effects. It moves colors toward gray. It moves values toward the middle. It reduces contrast. And most people think, when you say atmospheric perspective, they're thinking, oh, well, landscape, cityscape, buildings in the background that are little gray squares. But atmospheric perspective happens even in the scale of rooms. It can happen in dusty, dirty garages filled with a ray of light coming through it. There's a lot of atmosphere that is everywhere and can be exploited to great effect. Think of the air. It's always a good way to think of it. You're always painting air. We are looking at all these objects through air. This is not a vacuum. And what's in that air? If there is a lot of particles, dust, water, pollen, dirt, whatever, floating around inside this air, light is hitting on all those particles. It has weight. It's aerosolized, but it's a real object that light hits and light reflects off of and can obscure what you're looking at. So this has very little atmospheric perspective. Let's say something like, here's two examples. This has very little atmospheric perspective. Here, the room, the fans are on, there's nothing in there. Here, a bug bomb went off, and now there's fog in the air. Now, look how it distorts color. It brings the darks up in value. It takes the lights down in value. It should probably also, to be correct, it should soften edges. So a lot of these edges that I have painted should probably be softer. Like that edge is too hard. This all gets softer. Now, if things are quite thick in there, I could even exploit the idea of atmospheric perspective to bring this forward by saying this is brighter, this has a harder edge, the values are a bit darker down in the front, and then exaggerating that this goes even further away by making this even more in the middle value. So what this has is it starts to not really confuse what is in light and shadow. I mean, we still see that, but light and shadow are much closer together. So let's see how that would work here. I'm going to talk about this trick here in a minute, but in a nutshell, that's what would happen. But I know this is done a lot in digital art where things that are in the background, you just take a large brush and kind of blot it out, but there's no real consideration of the effect of the edges and color. So for instance here, all these edges getting much softer, some of these shapes losing their identity entirely. And so I really did have to repaint what's back here in a slightly different way. And like that edge, still too hard. So there's a lot of painting that has to go on. You can't just take a big airbrush and blot things out. But it does affect the types of lighting. And any type of lighting, really, if you add a lot of atmosphere to Rembrandt, what you're going to get is these darks will be more affected than anything. And you'll see these darks lightening up but the lit side will shine through. I think most of the time in atmospheric perspective you do see the effect on the darks more than the lights, even though that would be a little bit lighter as well. But often strong atmospheric perspective has the effect of unifying a picture, and there's quite a bit of atmospheric perspective going on here. If there was nothing in between us and that hair, you'd be seeing full value range, like here. If that hair is black, it's black, but here it's not. Now I'm assuming that it is, but there are some areas that we can assume would go entirely black because there's an absence of light, no reflected light, no way any light source can get to it, and that would be going black. So by that assumption, there is something in the atmosphere here. Another thing that tells me there's a lot of stuff in the air is how diffuse a lot of these edges are. There's very few hard edges. So throwing some stuff into a smoke machine can be very helpful if you're after a specific effect. It does have a nice unifying and softening effect that can be very effective. And we're all concept artists here. We know how we use and abuse this idea all the time. So atmospheric perspective is not just an optical or naturalistic thing that you can exploit in painting buildings that are a long way away. Atmospheric perspective is something you can exploit in drawings. And look at how much contrast there is in this foot to this foot. Now this is an artificial exaggeration of the principles of atmospheric perspective to gain depth. Now how is it this foot is rendered with the same line weights and contrast as this hand, and yet this is darker? Well, it's in shadow, yes, but it's a matter of manipulating things to get the viewer to look at what you want them to look at. See how this line is entirely broken, there's nothing there. A clod like me was going to draw this, I would have just said, well, the arm is there, just connect it. There's no fog back there, there's not a fog bank. A better drawing like this, which is done by Harry Carmine, wonderful art center artist. He was teaching when I was a student there, but I never had his class, and I've always regretted that, even though he's so advanced and I'm such a noob that probably to this day I still wouldn't understand what he was trying to teach, but I can at least look at his drawings and see what's going on. This arm back here, is this some amazing colossal transformer and there's like a cloud bank moving in? No! This is all just atmospheric perspective but applied to drawing. So it's something that is a very powerful depth cue that you can use even though it might not be technically, naturalistically correct. Look at this, one leg on top of the other leg. And if you're going to paint this, think of the implications for painting this. These edges would be softer, there'd be less contrast back here, fewer details, same thing with the leg there. So it transfers over, and the same thing I was doing here. You have to paint this in a different way than what's up here. And I can manipulate my edges and my values and my contrast, everything at my disposal to get these knees to come out and this to stay back. So let's look at some other examples of this. This is called an Asaro head, designed by the painter John Asaro. If you want to get one, which I highly recommend, you can look it up on Google. I think somebody still has some, or they're remanufacturing it. These are just taken, with a cell phone camera, and they're pretty well exposed. I'm not the world's greatest photographer, but I think it is very useful to look at these heads in different lighting situations and analyze what is what in terms of the sources of light and why some areas are light and some are dark. So let's look at this one. Primary light, sun, point source. You have hard cast shadows. You can see the hard cast shadows there, where this is the cool, diffuse light source of the sky. The reflected light coming off the environment on the ground is all this green. It's just amazing how much, color you can see in how much this color influences that. One interesting thing about this, as you could deduce from the way that this is lit, is behind the viewer is something big and dark. Because if the sky is equally lit, this plane should be much, much lighter. And that's true. We're standing underneath a tree. You can even see some of the shadows from the tree here and there. So you can really feel the volume of that circle. Top plane of the ear getting much more light. Front plane of it getting much darker. Look at this inverted cylinder there where it turns back up to the sky. It gets colder, warmer. So each one of these shapes has a gradation in it. Even though there may be a flat plane here, no two areas are receiving exactly the same amount of light. And so if it's completely flat, you're going to see that change. Here's a real good example from darker to lighter. And there's probably a slight hue shift as well. And this is something you can bring into your own paintings, is including changes within each shape. Not a lot, but like from there to there, that's pretty dang flat. But if I were painting this, I would paint this as darker, and the color actually, I'm not sure, I'd probably go lighter and greener and darker and redder. So I'm changing both in value and in saturation and in color, all three aspects of color. I'd probably paint this where this goes down, should be greener, it goes back out this way. I'm not sure why this is not bluer. That should be much, much bluer than it is. There's a strong plane change from there to there. Look how much reflected light you're getting back into this little shape where the light from here bouncing back up into here. Look at the accent value where the nose hits the front part of the barrel of the mouth, where you're getting shadow not only from the primary light source, but the sky diffuse source can't get to it, and the bounce lighting from the ground can't get to it. The result? Dark. Same thing here, same thing there, same thing there, same thing right there. So this accent values, always be looking out for them because they're really quite important. You can render the entire head just by painting those little darks in the right place. Quite amazing. You can paint an entire head, basically make a gradation, get the silhouette right, and put in those little darks, and it'll say head. So let's look at another one. Let's look at one with direct lighting as well. You know, kind of how this is distributed is a little bit like our example of 19th century lighting, but how would this look with Rembrandt lighting? Well, all this would be black, very dark, with lost edges. And it works just fine that way. But now with light coming back into these areas, you know, this, instead of being green, this is more warmer. There's a lot of, you know, warm dead leaves on the ground, so you're getting this warmer. And usually the reflected light is warmer just because the sky fill is so cool, it looks warmer by contrast, like by simultaneous contrast actually. So where is the darks, where are the darks running on this head? I see it as, you know, here, here, there, inside there, and there. Actually it's kind of similar to the other one. But now why are these super dark? Because they are areas that none of the three types of light can get to. Reflected light from the ground can get there, but if you go up, like here, this is more accurate. The sky can't get to it, the ground light can't get to it, the primary light source is shadowed. So that's why that goes darker. You can see areas in here where things are going much, much darker because of the absence of light. People talk about these core shadows where light rolls away from the form as being darker, and that's true. Why is that darker? Because you really see dark core shadows in kind of Rembrandt style lighting, and the type of lighting we're looking at here, this isn't going to go really dark because it's being filled by ambient cool. But it's the absence of reflected light, it's the absence of a primary light. That's why it goes darker. You don't have to, you know, look up there to see this. This is a perfect example of where there is no reflected light. So let's look at another one. Now this one is kind of interesting because this is the first one where the primary light source is not a point source. You can see, because where's the cast shadows? Where's my hard cast shadow lines? No, it's very soft. There's an opening back over here off the right of screen, so there's a huge amount of light, but coming from a diffuse source, coming in here and making these soft shadows. So here we have the primary light, which is slightly warmer, and not a lot of cool fill. We're deep under the trees, so we're being shadowed from the diffuse sky, like this one. Here we're fully seeing the sky and no primary light because we're in shadow. Here we're in shadow, but there's primary light working in here in a diffuse way. You can see, the difference. So these two lighting situations are really pretty similar. And where this one goes very, very dark is here. And what's back over here? Dense dark jungle. Nothing. No light at all. So no light there. Any plane that faces over there goes dark. Look at how dark that is. This is getting a little bit of the primary light wrapping around the nose, and then how dark that is. Now there is some light coming in from above, or else you wouldn't see that. If this is really darkest jungle, you could make your top planes dark as well. But it's not exactly like that in this lighting situation. So this is another diffuse light. The primary light is very diffuse. Probably a third of the hemisphere is the light source. And again, you don't see those hard cast shadows. How the light just kind of comes and wraps around that corner and then is soft. This is funny because this is reverse of what most people would tell you. You want to have a soft edge here with a point source. It should be soft and then hard. That would be this type of lighting. But because this is so diffuse, probably what would happen is this would stay soft, and you'd probably soften this too. If you were painting a real head, it would look like that. That sharp edge is just because of the planes of these ceramic heads. Is there a primary light source here? Nope. It's all in shadow. So the diffuse light source of the sky is promoted to primary light source. And some of the reflected light, that's the secondary. So you can see nice warm coming in from over here where the light is hitting. I'm surprised there isn't more green from all this green. There should be. One other interesting thing about this lighting is this entire dark area. Where is that coming from? Well, it's coming because there is something off the stage this direction that's big and dark, notably the house. If that house wasn't there, one, we'd be getting strong sunlight on this. We wouldn't see this dark. You can see the shadows here, the cast shadows there, the cast shadow there. So there's a lot of things that is cluing you into that there is some big dark shadow object over here on the right side of frame. And all these details are consistent with that. But another nice thing is that you can really see the vertical wash of the diffuse skylight coming down. This is going really warm. Could be because of the table. It's coming through the table, although I doubt it. One exercise you can do with these ceramic heads is try to paint the planes. You have the photography of it, you know how the values are running, but now get rid of it. Now you know where the planes are, and this works, I think, a bit better on diffuse light. So what I did here is I duplicated the background, ran a find edges command on it, and then set that layer to multiply. So you can paint underneath this and still figure out where your shapes are. So with that blanked out, try to figure out what these values would be. So we know the light's coming from the top. So let's isolate everything that is facing upward on a new layer. We know that's facing upward. We know the top of the ear, probably the break there. There's probably a break. We know that this to that, it's not facing straight up as that, but I'm going to dark it down in a minute. But I think I'll go ahead and make all this one value because it's so diffuse. That's probably going to be getting top light, and this as well. So now I'm going to turn on self-masking, that's the / key, and go up in value from that. So I don't want to go so dark here as to start to confuse it with this. And that's about as close as I want. I like this transition from there to there. That turns that corner well. So I'm going to go brighter up there, and then try to get this plane to that plane. So I'm going to darken this down. So now we have a break there. And this is fairly diffuse, so I'm going to soften that. And okay, so that we know, and there's probably a little cool there. Now what is facing the bottom? Well, this. Now remember that there's that house back there, so there's this entire area that's dark. So let's block that in. Now this is very much in shadow. That's probably a shadow of the ear, of the nose. This is facing up. This is facing down, up, and coming darker to there. So remember we have this nice diffuse warm light coming in here. I think I'll play that up a little bit. But we're not going to be seeing it over here because this is all shadowed from the light, whatever this light source is. I don't want to see it there, down, like that. So this facing down, this is probably really going to be quite dark. There still might be some sky influencing this, but let's go dark with that plane. I say there, there. You know, these are the darks I was talking about, you know, where there is no light, and probably here too. And I remember this one was darker, but that's cheating because I'm going off memory. But let's so let's not do that. This plane to that plane, this one would probably be slightly lighter, and the darks would be more toward the front of that plane. So you see front plane to side plane. And this entire ear would probably be darker. You know, there's not that big of a jump from this plane to that plane, so I don't want to go that dark. And, you know, super subtleties like this plane change there, so it's definitely different than this plane that's sticking out, and then it rotates down or falls down a little bit there. So now let's see how we did. Now let's just duplicate this. Pretty close. So what I messed up on is this value there. I went lighter there. I really should have gone darker. So now I'm kind of missing that overall idea of the head being broken into these two different planes on the side. Probably the darker here. Missed that one. I did get these two darks in the right place, and yes, bottom of the nose is definitely a third plane. So it's kind of using, let's see, 1, 2, 3. It's a 3-value system. Well, maybe with this thrown in there as an extra. You know, this probably the same reason bottom of the nose. I would say the mouth should be darker there and there. So but here you can see the wrap of the barrel of the mouth, which I did not get. But anyway, it's neat to play this game with yourself, is take 15 photographs of a ceramic head in different lighting conditions and try to recreate them. That will really help your analysis when you're painting more out of your head and really go through what the 3 lighting sources are. What is the lighting on this head so that you can recreate it from memory later. Your analysis will be better and stronger. This lesson is on color, and color is very closely associated with lighting. You can't really separate them. They kind of blend one into the other. So to a certain extent there'll be a review from our last lesson, but the main focus of this lesson is on color. And the main point that I would like for you to get from this lesson is this idea here. Value, color, and saturation are completely separate things. Now I know that may seem obvious, but it has real implications for you as an artist, and I hope it is somewhat liberating, because I know that many times people are saying, I don't know what color to make this, and the colors don't look right, or they're washed out or muddy. So we will go over some of those pitfalls. In general, these are separate things and they are in a hierarchy as I have set them up here. Usually it's hue, saturation, and value, but I've changed the order here to be what I consider to be most important for a painter, and that is value. As I pointed out in a previous lesson, if you get the shapes right, even value doesn't really matter that much. So take a look at this image. Card drawings by Harry Bradley. So he's done something very interesting with the shadow areas of the wheels. It's flat, which means it's low contrast and in shadow, but it's white. That's exactly the opposite of what you might think. So the car body's dark, or the wheels are white, and so is the shadow under here. And the shadow areas are treated as one distinct, uninterrupted shape. So that's kind of my point, we have a hierarchy here, and we're kind of going down the list now. So it's drawing in shape first, and then value, and then somewhere along the line is color, saturation. In dealing with color, it's very important to separate these things out and treat them as separate things. And we're going to be doing a bunch of exercises that will teach you how to separate them out. This wonderful magic picker, be sure to look this up online. You could have a lock where you can change the hue and the saturation, but the brightness more or less stays the same. You need to be able to do this without some type of mathematics or this color picker doing this. You need to be able to do it just by eye, so we will get into that in a moment. But first, let's start at the beginning of color. What are the influences? What are the aspects, either in the subject or in the environment or the lighting, that causes a particular object or shape to have the color and value that it does? Well, the first and probably the most important is the local color and local value. So imagine you're at Home Depot and you're in the paint section and you have one of those light boxes with painfully neutral light that is coming from every direction equally, a diffuse light box with perfectly neutral lighting. You put a yellow cardstock and it's going to probably look a lot like that. The idea is that it's going to be exactly the same everywhere. There's no form changes, there's no light changes. It's completely flat, so you're going to have a flat color. Let's make this a little more complicated, and we put a box into that light box. Now we have light coming from every direction, and it's all hitting this equally, and it's going to appear somewhat like this. Not entirely like this, because we're seeing like this surface at a slightly different angle than this. If this were completely matte, you would see some difference in value from here to here. So once we start to get beyond a perfect environment where light is coming in from every angle equally, then you're going to start to see differences in these planes. So we're going to stick with the idea that this is a yellow cube. Since this is just gray to light cube, you can't really interpret it because you don't know what the lighting is. It could be gray, it could be white, it could be a white cube in a low lighting intensity environment. But let's start with that. Now let's say we have this light box and we turn off the lights over here. So that means we're going to be getting a slightly darker color over here. And now it starts to read. The shapes are correct, and we have a lit side and a shaded side, or at least there's some differential between where the light is and where it is not. Now you guys think like, okay, how do you know what color actually to put there? It's pretty much the same hue, but it is just slightly darker. Now let's say I were to maybe make this redder. It still reads because the values are correct, but this is a very different color, a different hue than what I had. Let's go the other way. Well, that works too. So I think I'm starting to build a case where the hue doesn't really matter. What if you went, really, really wild like that? Well, this implies some very strong other lighting that is overpowering the local value and color, so we're not going to go that wild with this. The thing to keep in mind is what color this is really depends on the environment. If it's still a neutral light, then that means that really we just need to be dropping this down in value and keeping the same hue. If this neutral light is hitting an environment that is, let's say there is red out here, let's just say there's some spilled red paint there. Now this red is going to be affecting this hue. How? Well, let's say we go from there, we're going to shift it redder, and just by the nature of the color wheel it's going to go slightly darker. Let's reinforce the point. And you're going to get something more like that. Now this ties together with that. Your eye interprets the light, the shadow, the reflected light, and reflected color. The top surface is not affected by this, so this could be anything from continuing to be warm, implying other warm surfaces up here that this key light is reflecting into, or it could be much cooler, and that would imply a diffuse, cool light. You remember from our lighting lesson, that's usually a safe assumption that a diffuse light source from above is probably going to be cooler. You're alluding to the sky. So that's usually a safe break to make between top surfaces and side surfaces. Side surfaces stay a little warmer, top surfaces stay a little bit cooler. That seems like a natural environment with a neutral to warm key light and a cool diffuse source from above and probably some warm bounce light coming in here. But now we've kind of looked at it in terms of color, whereas before we were looking at it in terms of lighting sources. Now, I was saying earlier that in this environment, our perfect light box world, would all these three planes be exactly the same? And I said, no, they probably wouldn't, because you're viewing this at a different angle than this. Even though the light incident and reflecting is on a diffuse surface like this, not really reflective at all, it is going to be very much like this. It'd be interesting to try to make this actually happen, but it would be extremely difficult. For painting, we don't want this to happen. We do want to see differences between these surfaces. So we've done that in this world. We've got a warm key light. I should probably add the shadow there. I'm going to put that on a separate layer. But we need to start to add indications of the light more realistically, as in there's light falling off, as in the light hitting here is more intense than the light hitting here. Now, if this is sunlight, that's not technically correct, but like I was saying with this, it's technically not correct to think of all these surfaces as completely flat. If we had this lighting situation, we want to make it different, so we're going to do everything that we can, including something that isn't quite physically accurate, to reinforce the feeling of form and to reinforce the feeling of light. And that means I am going to start to put gradations on all these different shapes. And it just so happens we've set it up here so that these shapes are actually separate planes. One note before I do that, as you notice the error that I made here with this shadow color. So this to that is pretty much a shade, simply darker version of this color. Well, I've already said that we've set this up as a diffuse cool light from the sky. We are using that convention. So wouldn't that reflect into here? Yes, it would. So this actually needs to be getting cooler because this is being affected by this warm light source, and here that warm light source is being blocked, or maybe just a neutral light source, and this is being influenced by the diffuse cold of the sky. So let's make that much cooler. And when you make a red cooler, yeah, it turns purple. And here's a funny little thing. What about this part of the shadow, where this is being blocked from most of the sky? So maybe that will stay a little bit warmer because it's being influenced by light hitting here, bouncing back in there, and coming back in there. Let's get back to where we were with adding gradations and color changes to each of these planes and shapes, because the planes and shapes as we set up here are the same. So in conventional industrial rendering, the idea is to have this gradation and a hue shift and a saturation shift in every shape from top to bottom and from side to side. So top to bottom here and side to side there, it evens out to be a diagonal. So almost all these gradations are going to be on a diagonal here. This shape back here probably goes this way. This shape here, the entire ground shape, would the gradation be across here, or would it be at an angle here or there? Well, it would be less dimensional to do it flat to the picture plane, so we're probably going to go from here to there. So let's get started on each of these planes. So this color I'm going to drop off a little bit since this is still warm. I'm going to modulate it with different versions of a warm yellow. And that's just a slight gradation there. You see how that makes it feel like the light is hitting here and less here. Now I have not made this effect so strong that I start to lose the turn of the form here. That would be not good. You can see that if I really went dark and tried to tell the viewer that the light hitting here and here is almost exactly the same, they're not going to buy it. They're going to start to think that this thing is rounded. So that's too much. Okay, let's go to the top plane. This top plane is being lit by our neutral to warm key light, which is a point source. Remember our last lesson. And the diffuse cool. So this has a relatively warm and a relatively cool light working on it, which is why it isn't turning entirely green and is still fairly bright. So what kind of color and value change could we make here? Well, we're seeing it at a fairly low angle, so maybe as it goes further back and away from us, things turn a little bit greener and lighter. Here it's being a little bit less influenced by the sky and a little bit more local colors actually coming through, so that gets warmer. So I really haven't changed my value too much, but I have changed the hue. Now from here to there, that diagonal, I am going to change the value, because here you're seeing it could get somewhat reflective, but also it's much further away from this key light, which is the strongest light that we have. So I'm going to be making that much darker. And maybe this one over here going slightly lighter. Again, watching this edge from there to there, I probably got too light. I'm starting to lose that. So maybe the entire shape has to come down in value. Easiest and quickest way to do that is like that. So let's go on to the this side. Now, what is influencing this, and how can I work with our diagonal idea? Well, this side is entirely in shadow, so it is being influenced by the diffuse cool from the top, but also, probably most importantly, is light reflected off this red coming back into this surface. So that's the right color, but it's the wrong value because I'm going darker, and I probably want to go from that color, and value would work better here, and then a contact patch that would actually get bigger as it goes back. So really what I've done is I've just darkened down the shadowed side, and I let what I originally blocked in stand in as the reflected light. And you might say it's a little bit yellow for this very strong red, and I think you'd be right. So let's see, but I don't want to make it that dark. I like the value there, I just don't like the hue. So I change the hue. Something more like that. Now that feels to me like yellow being overpowered by this color. Now, there's certain colors that tend to pick up this type of hue. If you have a yellow object, it tends to pick up color casts from the environment very easily. And also think in terms of